what do Hitler and Nazis and then Churchill and the Britons teach us about marketing, do you think?
If you're really mischievous, you'd say that from an advertising standpoint, Hitler was an art director and Churchill was a copywriter.
Go into that more, please.
Well, Hitler was undoubtedly an artist, okay? Not terrible, by the way.
Wasn't he? That's why wasn't he a failed artist?
The whole of world history would have been different if he'd got into art school, but I think he was turned down. And patently was very interested in architecture, design, grandiose designs for cities, etc. And you can find in slightly dodgy secondhand bookshops, I'm not making this up, Nazi design manuals on the precise proportions of swastikas, flags, colours. I don't know if they had Pantone references back then, but they were it was a visual brand for the most part, okay?
Yeah.
Whereas Churchill was undoubtedly, principally persuasive through the medium of words and writing, copywriter.
Yeah.
But by the way, I don't know where I read this, but I think Hitler's only paid employment in his entire life, because he didn't actually get paid a salary as Chancellor, was 2 weeks working in an advertising agency on a brief something like a deodorant or antiperspirant. So he actually worked as an art director in an ad agency for a couple of weeks.
Wow.
It is interesting because, in a sense, it's horrible to admit it, but they were really rather good at branding.
Yeah.
In terms of, visual consistency.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think as egregious and heinous as it was, like to create some sort of movement, there's in the most repugnant things, there's lessons. In the most beautiful things, there's lessons.
It's worth remembering that there probably, I don't know about this, it'd be interesting to debate it. There probably was a period in history where you had mass access to mass media.
Mass access to mass media.
Well, in other words, everybody had a radio. Lots of people went to the cinema and watched propaganda newsreels or the Leni Riefenstahl film or whatever. And where also people hadn't quite acquired. First of all, they had no alternative set. If you think about it, newspaper, cinema newsreel, radio broadcast. Okay, that is and word of mouth. Okay, but word of mouth is kind of slow, particularly in less densely populated areas. Okay, so those are your sources of information, and they're all controlled by the government. And people had not yet acquired a degree of immunity to communication. Now, let me just explain. If people went to the cinema in the very early days of the cinema, and you had the cinema screen would show something which is a train shooting directly towards the screen, or a man firing a gun out of the screen. This would be in the silent era, 1910, 15, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. The audience would actually duck below the seat, okay, in terror. Now, that's interesting, because obviously now, children might do that very, very early on. I don't know. But nobody would do that now. If you went to an adult cinema performance and they had a shot of a train heading straight towards you, nobody would go, "Ah!" Right?
Yeah.
You'd look ridiculous. But there was a time when people absolutely did that. Now, okay, what that suggests is that there was a time when moving pictures were, just disproportionately potent and persuasive. And also people hadn't acquired a kind of skepticism. So they were extraordinarily kind of susceptible, I think, to mass manipulation, because you only had mass media. There wasn't the arsehole on Twitter doing you didn't even have Joe Rogan inviting guests who thought this Nazism might be not altogether a good thing.
Sure.
Okay? You didn't have any kind of real dissent. And society was fundamentally pretty conformist, particularly in Germany, particularly at a certain time, at that period in history. And so, there was undoubtedly, you could argue that it was going to happen somewhere. That kind of collective insanity would happen somewhere. Because, I'm not suggesting, there are lots of reasons for these things, but it was a very unusual media environment.
Yeah, but because Germany lost all their status at the end of World War I, and Hitler's whole promise was, Will Saw talks about this in the Status Game, as how they're going to bring up, he was the sort of the promised land of bringing back Germany's status on a global scale. and humans' desire for status.
And there was some economic evidence that it was undoubtedly in a resurgence, but undoubtedly making them feel good about themselves again, and also selling the narrative that they'd been sold down the river at the Paris Peace Conference or whatever, which they kind of had been. Actually, if I'm being honest, okay.
What happened to the Paris Peace Conference?
I mean, so the reparations and general punitive damages imposed on the Germany after World War One, if one's being honest, largely at the behest of probably of the French more than the British and the Americans, effectively created a sense of justifiable grievance.
Justifiable grievance.
It all happened. It's all my cousin Woodrow's fault. He's bizarrely like my fourth cousin twice removed or something. Woodrow.
You always say that.
But no. I mean, weirdly. But he got ill. He got Spanish.
How did you find that out?
Very strange thing. Somebody wrote to us from Canada who was obsessed with tracing our ancestry back to almost interminable Calvinist ministers in Scotland. And I was reading this going, and then they were descended from so-and-so, and the guy in a painting in Sterling Art Gallery called The Covenant as Baptism. The guy doing the baptism is apparently a sort of distant ancestor of mine, I think called Williamson. Okay. And anyway, in this sort of footnote, he goes, and and is also the ancestor of Woodrow Wilson. I was going, kind of, it's a bit more interesting than a bloody Calvinist minister, isn't it? But she seemed absolutely fixated on an awful lot of Calvinist ministers. But he probably got Spanish flu during that peace conference where terms were negotiated.
Who did?
Woodrow Wilson.
Right.
And to an extent went slightly doolally.
Right.
Okay.
But how did that affect
Well, there were various unfortunate decisions taken with the benefit of hindsight, one of which was insulting the Japanese by not fully acknowledging them as, and that was under pressure from, I think, the Australians in the Commonwealth delegation, if I'm right, or the Empire delegation, it would have been called then, and also imposing costs on the Germans of an extent and duration that allowed them to feel, with some reasonable justification, that they'd been sold out. Okay, so therefore by the way, this is a sort of bit of a standard narrative, and I might add that there are lots of other explanations for what's going on. Okay, I mentioned the media environment as well. The power of moving image. One thing they were pretty good at was propaganda. Not just branding, they were pretty good at it.
When you say the power of moving image.
There are sections, I've never read the bloody thing, but I've been told there are sections of Mein Kampf where he describes what makes a good poster, what makes for good persuasion.
Really?
And then you also had, I suppose, work of people like, so the Paris Peace Conference, Woodrow Wilson was accompanied by Bernays, who was often considered the kind of, a relation of Freud, who's kind of the godfather of mass persuasion techniques. PR, really. He's more than advertising.
What was his name, sorry?
So Edward Bernays.
Yeah.
He was the extraordinarily influential person who effectively, mostly for commercial purposes in the United States advertising. But it was interesting that the extent to which persuasion was taken seriously at that time is evidenced by the fact that the President of the United States took a kind of PR guy, an expert in, persuasion and public opinion, took him across the Atlantic with him to the Paris Peace Conference.
Yeah, that is mental.
So, by the way, it's a bit boring history to go, God, they were nasty to the Germans, therefore they made possible, a resurgence of da-di-da-di-da. But, it's part of the truth. Like everything. There are narratives, and there are, generally we like narratives because they simplify.
Yeah.
But it is, I do find it fundamentally interesting that, the question is, some of those people who are natural dissenters, conspiracy theorists and nutters, they can be a general pain, but you need them around because sometimes they're right.
Yeah.
Okay. Most of them, the people who kind of annoy me are the people who believe every conspiracy theory. Okay, because you go, okay, look, some of this stuff succumbs to a simpler explanation. Maybe they did land on the moon. Maybe Lee Harvey Oswald shot JFK. Okay. However, it's highly unlikely that conspiracy theorists are wrong about everything. Or at least their conspiracy may be wrong, but their doubting of the official narrative may be perfectly healthy at some point.
Yeah, that's a
great phrase, by the way. Just because it makes sense doesn't mean it's true.
Just because it makes sense doesn't mean it's true.
So, quite often we explain something with something and we go, yeah, that makes sense. And therefore we stop asking questions.
Espressos is sponsored by supply chain software gurus Unleashed. It talks to your e-com and accounting software. It's helped islands cut admin time in half, get granular clarity on your margins, know where your stock is, don't miss availability. Brands like Candy Kittens, Tiny Rebel and Trip all use Unleashed, and so should you.